a book of the Bible, they don't know where to go. So, in case you are one of them, it isn't the beginning of the Bible. Without it, the Bible will make no sense, because a lot of things that we hear about in the rest of Scripture arise in Genesis. We will not understand even ourselves if it was not for Genesis. In fact, many people today, because they have not taken Genesis as the foundation of our origins, they believe they are animals. They look at themselves and they look at animals. They say the animals have 2 eyes, they have a head, they have a nose, they have ears. They look like me. They look at chimpanzees and gorillas and so on. They don't look that different from us, and therefore many conclude that we are animals. But it's only when you read the origins of man in Genesis that you know that God intended man to be different from animals. He created man in his image. But we'll come to that. That's a different subject that we'll talk about. So I would like to first maybe tell you about the literary style of Genesis. Sometimes when you don't understand the nature of the writing, it is very easy to misunderstand what the writer is trying to say. So we need to know what is the style of writing being used. The first point I want to make is that Genesis and its different parts of it, not the whole of book is that. So there's different styles of writing that were used. In fact, it is said that the book itself was broken up into several parts. Okay, it is not one part, and I'll show you this part as we go along through the book. So these parts were memorized. Remember, this was a generation where the majority of people could not read or write. So the only way they knew the stuff was to memorize them. So they memorized these pieces in those chunks. Okay, so it was poetic and figurative and not scientific. And therefore, when we read this book, we should not be approaching it as a scientific text. Okay? For example, when you read the book of Job, which was written around this same time, Genesis was written, it says to Job, this is God speaking to Job, he says, "Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Who shaped the sea behind doors when it burst forth from the womb? When I made the clouds its garment and wrapped it in thick darkness? When I fixed limits for it and set its doors and bars in place." Now, if you read this description, literally, not in a poetic sense, not in a figurative sense, you'll begin to think that the earth has foundations almost in a similar way that a house has foundations. You'll begin to think that the sea was born out of a womb, for example. Okay? You'll see that the sea was somewhere behind closed doors. And God has locked it behind closed doors like somebody can be locked out behind doors. Now, this is poetic language that's being used. And we need to remember, as we go through the book, that this is the kind of language the writer is using. The people who listened to it at that time would have no problem listening to that. For example, I was reading a newspaper article, and this guy, a journalist, was talking about our president. And he's talking about Zuma and his 100 wives. Okay? Now, in 100 years or 2,000 years, when somebody read that article, they will think Zuma had 100 wives. Okay? But you and I, because we know he doesn't have 100 wives, we know what the journalist means when he says Zuma and his 100 wives. He's not being literal. He does not literally have 100 wives. All 100 means he has many wives. And you'll find as we go through the book, there are many times when numbers are referred to, and the numbers are not literal. They simply refer to a lot or to very little. And that's what the intention is. So we need to remember that. If you look at Matthew 23:24, Jesus says, "Blind guys, you strain your water so you won't exactly swallow a gnat, which is like a mosquito, but you swallow a camel." Okay? But we know human beings cannot swallow a camel. So this is a figure of speech. He's talking about how they emphasize small matters and they ignore the big glaring issues that are facing them. The second point I want to make is that the literary style of the book, it is anthropomorphic, which is that it refers to God in human terms. Anthropomorphic is it's a term that comes from the Greek words anthropos, which means man, and morphe, which means form. So you'll find that God is referred to in human terms. Okay? Now, when we read that, we should not think that God is like us, that God is man. Okay? So, for example, when we read in Genesis 2 verse 7, which we'll read, which we'll come to later in the series. Then the Lord God formed the man from the dust of the ground. He breathed the breath of life into the man's nostrils, and the man became a living person. Now when we read that God breathed, now we know what breathing for us means. Now God does not breathe the same way you and I breathe. He does not rely on oxygen like you and I. So we should not read into that statement that God is like us and He breathes oxygen like us. Okay? So we need to understand the kind of language being used. There's other things that it is historical. Okay? It is recording things that actually happened at some point in the past. But what is critical for our generation today, because at the time the book was written, there was no such thing as we call science, the way we understand science today. But for us today, one of the difficulties is that we are in a scientific world, and when we read the book, our scientific minds want to make impressions on the book. So we need to remember that it is not scientific. It is not precise in its numbers, as I mentioned earlier. It is not precise in its measurements, and it is not precise in its detail. The detail we are given is given for a particular purpose. So when we are given a particular detail, it's because the writer is wanting to tell us about something. There are other details he doesn't tell us about because they are not relevant to what he's wanting to tell us. And we need to remember that. Okay? For example, in Genesis 4 verse 24, we'll read, if Cain is avenged 7 times, then Lamech 77 times. Okay? So that's a figure of speech. It's not saying that Cain will be avenged 7 times and Lamech will be avenged 77 times. It was simply saying Lamech should be avenged a lot more than Cain should be. That's all it is saying. It is not giving us the magnitude and ratios. Because in a scientific mind, we start to say, okay, 7 into 77, so this is how many times Lamech should be avenged. And that's not what it is meant in the story. Okay, so we should then focus on the message of Genesis. And I want to put it to you that the message of Genesis is theological, primarily. Although it is poetic and historical and all those things, its message is theological. So we'll find the theology in the history, in the poetry, in the anthropomorphism that we are going to read about. All of that will be leading us and pointing us to the doctrinal teachings that the writer wants us to know. Okay? It foreshadows the coming of Jesus. Now the coming of Jesus, although we only hear about it in the New Testament, it comes in fulfillment then. It was already talked about in the book of Genesis. And unless we understand the book of Genesis, then the coming of Jesus becomes irrelevant. Which is why many today, when you talk about that they need Jesus, it doesn't make sense. Why do I need Jesus? Okay? When you don't understand Genesis, you will not understand why you need Jesus. And then we'll come to that point. It introduces the one triune God. Now, the time this book was written, it was a time when the world was full of pagan gods. It was full of all kinds of gods. People worshipped the sun, they worshipped the moon, they worshipped the stars, they worshipped the other men, they worshipped animals. Anything that they could not understand or that they were afraid of, they worshipped. Okay? And the book was written to dispel that idea that there are many gods you need to worry about. So as the Jews, the Hebrews were living in Egypt, and in Egypt, as we read, we'll come to some of those passages in the rest of the Old Testament, where they were worshipping the Egyptian gods and many other gods that the Egyptians worshipped. And God wants them to know that all these gods are nonsense. They must worship the only one true God. That all the things that they worship were actually created by the one true God. That's the purpose that He wants us to arrive at. Now, in our world today, there is nothing more crucial than this very point. Because in our world today, people believe that there is no creator God. That somehow there was a big bang and everything came to be. And if you don't understand Genesis 1 verse 1, that's the kind of conclusion you might reach. And so Genesis is more relevant today, I believe, than even it was in the times of Genesis. Because in the time of Genesis, at least some of those people, although they believe in all these pagan gods, they actually believe that those gods created the world. Okay? But today, our folly is because we have rejected Genesis 1 verse 1, we have come to believe that there was a Big Bang. And because there was a Big Bang, all of us have evolved from lower life to the life that we have today. And therefore we are not different to animals, as I've said. So because of the view we have today of science, we tend to see ourselves as animals. And if you look at our world today, people are behaving like animals because they don't know who they are. And that's because they don't understand the message of Genesis. So it highlights to us the folly of idolatry. Now, in the first 2 chapters, we find the creation account. Okay? Now, the creation account is the foundation of all scripture, if you like. Now, the creation account is given. Now, there are many, how can I put it? There are many views about what Genesis 1 and Genesis chapter 2 are actually talking about. Okay? Now, I've taken a view that I believe is more plausible. Okay? There is a view that says the world was created in chapter 1 verse 1. We'll go there just now and show you that. And then the devil destroyed it. And then in verse 2, it became formless and void, and God came and fixed it up. So there were 2 kinds of creation. There was a creation in the beginning, and then the devil comes and messes it up. And there's a second creation, which is what we read in from verse 2 going forward. That's one view. Okay? The view I have is that the writer is not giving us 2 different kinds of creation accounts. He is giving us one creation account. And what he does, and I'll show you that, what he does is that he starts in verse 1. So the 3 accounts he gave us are actually one account. Okay? The first account is Genesis 1 verse 1, where he says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So it's a statement of fact to say, in the beginning, that's what happened. Okay? And then the second part is from chapter 1 verse 2 to chapter 2 verse 3, where he then gives us how God actually fashioned the earth for man. But that detail is not separate from the creation of verse 1. It is giving us a little more detail about how that actually happened. And when he goes into chapter 2 verse 4 to verse 25, he is not giving us another different account of creation. He is now going into the more detail about how man was actually created. So you find that in Genesis 1 verse 1 we read the universe was created by God, the heavens and the earth. From verse 2 to chapter 2 verse 3, he tells us about the 7-day creation, about the creation of the seas, of the lights, of animals, of plants, and of man as male and female. Then in chapter 2 verse 4 to 25, he then goes into the detail and say, when he created man, he actually took ground. He took mud and made man out of the ground of the earth, out of the soil. And then he tells us the details of how he came to create the female. But in chapter 1, we only read about he created the male and female. But in chapter 2, he then gives us the detail of how the male and female were actually created. So when we go through the 3 different accounts, we are not reading different creation accounts, we are just reading the detail. It's like you say, Takalani built this house. That's one statement of Genesis 1 verse 1. If you want to go into the detail, you can go into the detail of how you put in the lights, how you plumbered the house, how you put in the electricity, how you put in the carpets. You are going into the detail. Okay? So what you find then from Genesis 1 to the end of Genesis chapter 2, we are finding him go into a little more detail about what some aspects were created by. Now he doesn't go through the detail of everything. He could, for example, have gone through the detail of how the sun was made. But he doesn't do that, because his purpose is not the sun, his purpose is man. Okay? Genesis and the whole Bible is about man and God. So the other things are mentioned insofar as they are related to the life of man on earth. And that's why his focus then is to go from Genesis to create the creation of the whole universe, to the creation of the world in preparation for man, and to the creation of man himself. So he's trying to focus us to what this book is about. Okay, so we'll start then with Genesis 1 verse 1 and 2. It says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Now that first statement, once again, is a matter of fact to tell us that God created everything that we see around us. Everything that is there, God created. And as I said earlier, this is an important statement for us who live in a scientific age. The age where we don't believe anymore That is a God who is creator. That we believe everything came to be by itself. And this becomes an anchor for us even in our age. That there is a God who created. It says, now the earth was formless and empty. Okay? Now almost in the same way that you say you can build a house. Now when you build a house, after you finish the house is still a shell. There's a lot more work that needs to be done to make the house habitable. And because the creation of the world the intention was the creation of man, because when God created the heavens and the earth, His purpose was not them, His purpose was man. Okay? So the creation of man was the objective. So when He creates the universe, His purpose is to find a place for man. And this is what He does. So He says, now when He has created this, it was formless and empty. Okay? And darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. Now the formless and empty concept, it is a Hebrew term called tohu bohu, formless and empty. Now in the Hebrew, there is no tohu and bohu, it's tohu bohu, formless, empty. That's actually how you must read those. So in the English translation, they put the end in between to make it more sensible for us. But there is a view that the only word in the two words that has meaning is tohu, which means chaos. Bohu is almost like to make it rhyme. Okay? So it's not tohu and bohu do not necessarily have specific meaning according to some experts. They say this is a poetic way of saying the world was in chaos. Okay? So in the same way that, for example, today we talk about something it was helter and skelter. Okay? The two words rhyme together, but the individual words don't mean anything. But together, helter skelter means it was chaotic. That's all it means. So tohu bohu simply means that the world was chaotic. Okay? Now, the writer is using that, and I want you to remember this every time, that the purpose is about man. So even when we read the creation account of all these things, the objective of it is to show us our lives in the light of who God is. So tohu bohu is used here as a shadow of the state of man without God. Okay? So if God is not involved, the result is tohu bohu, is chaos, is formless and emptiness. That's what we are supposed to read into that. In December, when we talked about Christmas, we quoted this passage from Jeremiah. In Jeremiah chapter 4, Jeremiah here is lamenting the state of Israel, that the Israelites were become very evil. And in the way it is described, God says to Jeremiah, my people are fools. They do not know me. They are senseless children. They have no understanding. Okay? They are skilled in doing evil. They know not how to do good. I looked at the earth and it was formless and empty, and at the heavens and their light was gone. Now this is a similar description to what we're going to find in Genesis 1 verse 2. He's using the same words to refer to the nature or the state of Israel being in sin. That they are formless and empty. And so when we read the formless and empty in Genesis 1 verse 2, we are being reminded of the state of man without God. Before God enters into the scene, the state is chaos. And that's the message that we're being told, that without God, our lives are chaotic. Okay? Now, one of the things that we see is that there was darkness that hovered over the earth. So, after the earth was created, it was covered in darkness. There was no light to light it. And this we read as we read earlier in Job chapter 38, verse 4 and 8 to 10. He says, where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Who shut up the sea behind the doors when I burst it forth from the womb? When I made the clouds its garment and wrapped it in thick darkness. Okay? So God here is telling Job that when I created the heavens, it was wrapped in darkness. Okay? Before you were there, the earth was wrapped in darkness, and I stepped in to bring in the light. Okay? So what we then also read in that passage here is that It was formless and empty, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. Now that's an important point to read, that the Spirit of God hovered over the chaos of the sea that was covering the earth. At this point, if you read further, as you'll see, the whole earth was covered in water. Okay? The whole earth was covered in water. It was underwater, the whole world. And it was chaotic. If you have been to the sea, you know how chaotic the sea is. Okay? There are waves all the time, and there's windy, there's storms, and that's how the world was before God steps in. But before God steps in, the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And that, I believe, is a foreshadow of the life of humans. That in our lives, even before God steps into our lives, when our lives are still chaotic, when we are still evil, the Spirit of God is hovering over us. From the time we are in our mother's wombs to the time we are born and then we grow up, the Spirit of God is with us. God is always there, hovering over the waters of chaos in our lives. And then He comes into our lives and everything becomes clear. In John chapter 14, verse 17, Jesus said, when He talks about that He's going to send the Holy Spirit, He says He is the Holy Spirit who leads into all truth. The world cannot receive Him because it isn't looking for Him and does not recognize Him. But you know Him because He lives with you now and later will be in you. Okay? So before the Spirit came on the day of Pentecost, the Spirit of God was hovering over the earth. It was hovering over the chaos that man was living in. And then in the coming of Jesus, the Spirit of God was able to come into man, as we saw at the baptism of Jesus. That when He was baptized, the Spirit of God descended like a dove onto Jesus. And this is what happens with us as well. That when we are baptized, the Spirit of God who was hovering over us actually comes and settles in us. And this is the message that we are being told in verse 2 of chapter 1. That the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters, over the chaos. And it is the Spirit of God which brings in the order that God wants in the world. Okay. So the waters of baptism, as I said, represent the chaos that we are in. And the Spirit of God who hovers over us until we receive God, then comes into us when God said, let there be light, and we receive Jesus, who is the light. And He becomes the light in our lives. So when you read about this, we need to remember that that is what is being told us. That the seas and oceans, and this may be the point I need to make, that the seas and oceans for the Hebrew mind represented chaos. And the Jews were very afraid of the sea. Okay? The Jews were very afraid of the sea. And probably that phobia might have arisen from the Red Sea when they saw how the powerful Egyptian armies were devoured by the sea. And therefore they didn't like the sea that much. So when there was a storm, when Jesus was with his disciples in the sea, and they were about to drown, that's why you can hear them crying out to Jesus, save us, because they could see that the sea was about to swallow them. Because in their memory as a nation, the sea was a dangerous place. And therefore you'll find, even when you go to Revelation, for example, Revelation 21 verse 1, that in their minds, the new world can no longer have the sea, because the sea is a dangerous place. It should not be there. So this is why when we read in Revelations, it says, then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the old heaven and the old earth had disappeared, and the sea was also gone. Now for a Hebrew person, to read that the sea is no longer there, that's good news. That this is a world that is now free from danger. The new heaven, the new earth, no longer has a sea, no longer has danger. It is no longer chaotic. And for them, the presence of God is to push the sea away. So when it says, and God said, let the waters separate and move out, and He creates land, for them that's how God brought in order in their lives. And therefore the fact that now God actually removes the sea completely, that for them represents that God finally reaches this point of creation where creation is perfect. Because creation starts with the world being covered in water. And then during the creation of chapter 1, the water gets moved away and we have the sea and then we have dry land. And then in the end, the sea actually disappears. And for them, that's the stage in which the world must go. And that's how they want to see it. And once again, it does not necessarily mean that the sea will no longer be there. Because John and the writer of Genesis are both using figurative language. All they could be saying is that it will be more orderly. The presence of God will be there in the earth, and the earth will no longer be a dangerous place. That's all the point he might be wanting to make. Not that the sea will no longer be there. Because we know that God can calm the seas. When the disciples were about to drown in the sea, God calmed the storm. So even if the sea is around, God can tell it to keep quiet and not to harm us. So we don't necessarily need to have the sea absent for us to be safe. We need God present to be safe. And that's the point I think we need to be mindful of. Okay? So as we see, then the first step in dealing with the chaos, with the tehu bohu, and the darkness of our lives, is to bring in the light. And this is what God does in Genesis 1 verse 3. It says, then God said, let there be light. And there was light. And God saw that the light was good. Then he separated the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness night. And evening passed, and morning came, marking the first day. Now, this is the beginning of the creation account in detail. Okay? Verse 1 simply tells us God created the heavens and the earth. Now the writer is going into some detail about how this came to be. Now he is not giving us every little detail. For example, he doesn't tell us how the waters were created. Okay? In the creation account, there is no information about how God created water. All that we find happening in the creation account is that God pushes the water on the one side to form a sea, and it leaves a dry land. But we don't actually hear about water being created, about God saying, let there be water. But it does not mean he did not create water. That detail was not necessary for the story. The writer is not telling us about the mechanics of how God could create water. So it could have been created even on the first day, before the light even was created. But that's not what the writer is about. The writer wants to tell us about light, because light is crucial for the way he's going with the story. Light is crucial for man, and that's the point he wants us to remember. So he tells us about the light. And as we saw in December, that light foreshadowed Jesus. When God says, let there be light, and there was light, and so the light was good, that light was Jesus. Because at this point, the sun is not created yet. The sun is created in day 4 of Genesis, on the Genesis creation account. But on day 1, we already have the light of the world. And the message here is that the light that mankind needs is not the light of the sun, but is the light of God. That's the message we're being told. And in fact, you'll see when we go to Revelation, just now I hope I've included it. John starts by making that reference to make the connection that the light of Genesis is actually Jesus, the Christ. He says in him was life, talking about Jesus. And that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness we read about in Genesis. And the darkness has not overcome it or understood it. The true light that gives light to everyone was coming into the world, talking about Jesus. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. Okay, so John begins to join the dots for us. That when the Genesis account tells us that in the beginning God says, let there be light, and there was light. That light was a foreshadow of the true light that was to come into the world to drive away the darkness of sin and chaos. So until Jesus actually comes into the world is still in darkness. And that's the message of Genesis. That the light is not good enough for us. The light of the sun does not give us light. Okay? Many of us, if you go, for example, to a mall where nobody knows you, okay? The fact that nobody knows you, you feel like you are in the dark, and you begin to behave badly. Because darkness is not necessarily the absence of light. Okay? It is when we cannot be recognized. So when you walk in the dark and people can't see you, you do bad stuff. That's why the criminals go out at night and do what they do. Okay? And if they want to rob, they go to areas where they are not known. Okay? Where you are not known, it's dark for you, even though the sun is shining. So we should not be fooled that because the sun is shining, that there is light. There is no light. And many Christians, they behave like that. That when there is nobody they know around, they behave as if they are in the dark. Because nobody is seeing them. Okay? And that's the darkness we need to worry about. It is not the darkness of the absence of light of the sun. And the book of Genesis and John join those dots to tell us that we should not be so much concerned about the physical light. We should be concerned about the light inside of us. Because when the light is inside of us, we're not worried about the darkness even. So if you have light inside of you, even though you walk in darkness, you walk in the light. And that's the message that the writer of Genesis is giving us. Okay? Chapter 8, verse 12, he then says, when Jesus spoke again to the people, he said, I am the light of the world. Okay? There's no more clearer way of telling us what is the light of the world that we find in Genesis 1, verse 3, than this statement. That Jesus is the light of the world. When God says, let there be light, he was foreshadowing the time when he's going to send his son, who is the light of the world, into the world. That's the purpose of this book. It introduces us to Jesus, who was going to come as the light of the world. And he says, whoever follows me will never walk in darkness. If you walk with Jesus, if you follow Jesus, even though you go out at night and nobody can see you, you continue to walk in the light. And that's the difference between the follower of Jesus and the one who is not. The other one walks in darkness, and the other one doesn't. So a believer, whether he's walking during the day or during the night, he continues to live as a child of light. Okay? So even when he's in the dark, he doesn't carry out works of darkness, because he is in the light. And that's what we need to remember. Okay? John 9 verse 5, he continues, while I am in the world, I am the light of the world. So we see this point being emphasized a lot. And once I said in Revelations, this point is repeated again by John. He says, I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. I did not see a temple in the city, because the Lord, God Almighty, and the Lamb are its temple. The city does not need the sun or the moon to shine on it, for the glory of God gives it the light. Okay? So we read earlier about the sea no longer being in the new world, in the new earth. Here we're also reading about the new city no longer needs the sun and the moon to give it light, because God is its light. And that is what we are supposed to be reading in Genesis 1 verse 3. That God, in his coming into the world, is bringing the light into the world. The city does not need the sun or the moon to shine on it, for the glory of God gives it light, and the lamp is its lamp. The nation will walk by its light, and the kings of the earth will bring their splendor to it. Okay? So let's conclude. Okay? So Genesis 1 verse 1 to 3, which we cover today, they introduce us to the pattern of God's salvation. Okay? And the pattern of God's salvation is that we start off in darkness, and God steps in through the Spirit of God, which was hovering over the chaos, and says, let there be light. And that's the story of our lives. Until God steps into our lives and says, let there be light in us, we will continue to live in darkness, in our evilness. Our lives are chaos without God, represented by the Tohu Bohu that we read about, which characterized the earth before God stepped in. His Spirit is not far off even in our darkness and sin. And that's the point that we read in verse 2, when it says, the Spirit of God hovered over the chaos of the waters. God is not far even when we are in the chaos. So even when we look at the world and we see chaotic things happening, even when we see in the country now, I was reading the headline in the Star yesterday, I think it was saying, a nation burning, and they had a picture of people burning tires. And as we listen to the news the past week, people are rioting all over the country. So even when you see that chaos, Genesis tells us the Spirit of God is hovering over the chaos. So even in that chaos, we can take comfort in the sense that God is hovering over the chaos and He will not allow us to destroy ourselves. There are many who are worried that one day the world will go up in smoke because of nuclear annihilation. They believe that we have so much nuclear weapons in the world that if somebody decides to use them, the whole world will go up in smoke. Now we know God has said, and we'll come to that later in the series, where God has said to Noah when he came out of the ark, that I will no longer destroy the world because of the evil of man. I'm going to save man from his evil. So even though we are living in a dangerous world, as Christians we don't need to be fearful and worried about that. Because God, Spirit, hovers over the world, and even the most callous evil men amongst us, the Spirit of God continues to be gracious towards them, that they do not destroy the creation that God has made. And God's Spirit is hovering over the world and is not far off from us. Okay? And once Jesus, who is the light of the world, comes into our lives, as we said earlier, the Spirit who has always been around us comes into us. So the account of creation is meant to show how God has planned to be with humans from the beginning, in and through Jesus. So the first part we saw is about the light. Okay? When the writer of Genesis is telling us about God saying, let there be light in the world, he was introducing us to the coming of Jesus as the light of the world. And that is always the intention. So the detail that we get given in Genesis 1 is the detail that is supposed to help us see how in fact God has always purposed for Jesus to be part of our story and how we are part of His. Okay? So the creation account is not an exhaustive account of the how of creation. And as I said, we don't get to know how the sun was created, how the water was created. So there's a lot of detail that the writer does not give us, but the detail that he does give us has theological significance for us. And that's the part we need to focus on. The stuff that are not mentioned, it does not mean that they didn't happen. Okay? So Genesis 1 verse 1, when it says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, is a statement that says everything was created by God. But now let me tell you about how some of the things were created, because those things have relevance and meaning for you as man. And that's what the writer goes into. So the other stuff, he doesn't go into the detail. Okay? So the account given in the creation story is to foreshadow the story of salvation, as we'll see when we go through the rest of the creation account in chapter 1 and chapter 2. So I'm hoping that as we go through this book, you'll begin to see how the story of Genesis is supposed to ground us in our lives, that in a world which no longer believes in God, we can be reduced to nothing. Because indeed, if we are like animals, if we are animals in our very core, there is no basis for moral behavior. There is no basis for me not to kill you if I want something. That's how the animals behave in the wild. If the lion is hungry, he eats the next thing he sees. And if I'm a human being and I'm hungry, and I walk into the street and see somebody carrying a loaf, there is nothing that stops me from grabbing it from them and eat it. Because that's how I should behave if I'm an animal. But the Genesis 1 is to tell us again that we are not animals. We are made in the image of God, and therefore we don't behave like them. We don't behave like animals. But we'll talk about that as we go through this creation account. I'm just hoping that as we go through this, you'll begin to make the links about how God intended us to be as humans. And that without these origins, without understanding the story of Genesis, the story of our origins, our lives become meaningless. And many today are living meaningless lives because they don't know where they come from.